I'll never forget the sound of absolute silence that filled the boardroom when I slid the prenuptial agreement across the mahogany table, watching April's confident smile crumble as she realized her carefully calculated seduction of my husband had just cost them both everything they thought they'd won. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the sterile conference room of Carver Associates, casting harsh shadows across the faces of the people who had once been my inner circle. April Strauss sat frozen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her manicured fingers still intertwined with my husband's, both of them staring at the document that would reshape their future in ways they never imagined possible. Section 12, subsection C, I said calmly, my voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Any spouse engaging in extramarital affairs forfeits all claims to business assets, intellectual property, and ongoing revenue streams derived from Wilkins' digital solutions. The irony wasn't lost on me. 15 years ago, when Curtis had laughed off my insistence on a prenuptial agreement, calling it unromantic and unnecessary, I had been the pragmatic businesswoman protecting what I'd built from nothing. Now at 53, that same document was about to protect me from the wreckage of his betrayal. April's face drained of color as the implications sank in. She wasn't just losing a married lover, she was losing access to the $15 million digital marketing empire that had consumed the last 2 decades of my life. The company I'd built from a spare bedroom in my 30s, turning late-night coding sessions and relentless networking into one of the most successful independent digital agencies in the Pacific Northwest. Curtis finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Esther, please, we can discuss this privately." "There's no need for what?" I interrupted, leaning back in the leather chair I'd purchased when we'd finally moved into our downtown Seattle headquarters. "For honesty? For consequences? For the legal protections I put in place because I knew better than to trust blindly?" The third person in the room, my attorney Dakota Carver, remained professionally silent, though I caught the slight upturn at the corner of her mouth. She'd been the one to draft this prenup all those years ago, warning me that marriages could end but businesses needed to survive. At the time, I thought she was being unnecessarily cynical. Now I understood, she'd been preparing me for exactly this moment. "You see," I continued, my voice gaining strength with each word, "while you two were busy playing house in the company apartment I purchased for client entertaining, I was busy discovering just how extensively you'd been mixing business with pleasure. Company credit cards for romantic getaways, my marketing budgets funding your little love nest, my client relationships being leveraged for your personal satisfaction." April finally spoke, her voice shaking with what I realized was more anger than remorse. "Esther, you're being dramatic. Curtis and I, what we have isn't some cheap affair. We're planning a future together." The audacity was breathtaking. Here was a woman I'd hired 3 years ago, promoted to senior account manager based on her apparent dedication and intelligence, telling me that systematically undermining my marriage and my business was somehow romantic. "A future," I repeated, tapping the prenup with one finger. "How interesting, because according to this document, that future won't include a single dollar from the company that facilitated your romance. In fact, it won't include Curtis having any financial stake in my business whatsoever." Curtis's face had progressed from pale to ashen. As my husband of 12 years, he'd grown accustomed to the lifestyle my success provided. The waterfront penthouse, the vacation home in the San Juan Islands, the freedom to pursue his artistic photography without worrying about mundane concerns like profit margins or client deadlines. All of that was about to disappear. "Esther," he said, his photographer's hands trembling slightly as he reached toward me across the table, "I know I've made mistakes, but surely we can work something out. 12 years of marriage has to count for something." I looked at those hands, remembering when they used to hold mine during long walks through Pike Place Market in our early dating days, when they gently brushed tears from my cheeks during the brutal first years of building my business, when they'd worn the wedding ring that was conspicuously absent now. "It does count for something," I agreed, my voice softening for just a moment before Steele returned. "It counts for exactly what we agreed it would count for, when you signed this document. Which, as I recall, you did quite willingly after Dakota explained every clause in detail." Dakota finally spoke, her professional demeanor intact, despite the personal drama unfolding. "Mrs. Wilkins is correct, Mr. Strauss. You had independent legal counsel review this agreement before signing. The infidelity clause was specifically discussed and acknowledged." The weight of their situation was finally settling over both of them. April's ambitious climb up the corporate ladder had just hit a wall she hadn't seen coming. Curtis's comfortable existence as the artistic husband of a successful entrepreneur was about to become a very different reality. "So what happens now?" April asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I stood up, smoothing down my charcoal blazer and gathering the documents that would soon be filed with the King County Superior Court. "Now you both learn that actions have consequences. Curtis, you'll be hearing from my divorce attorney within the week. April, your employment with Wilkins Digital Solutions is terminated effective immediately." As I moved toward the door, Curtis called out one last desperate plea. "Esther, please. This doesn't have to destroy everything we built together." I paused at the threshold, looking back at the man who had shared my bed, my dreams, and my success for over a decade. "You're absolutely right, Curtis. It doesn't have to destroy everything we built, but it will destroy everything you thought you were entitled to." The door closed behind me with a soft click, leaving them to contemplate the ruins of their carefully laid plans, while I walked toward a future I would now build entirely on my own terms. My name is Esther Wilkins, and at 53, I've learned that the most important business decisions are often the ones that feel the most uncomfortable at the time. 25 years ago, I was a single mother working 3 jobs in Tacoma, Washington, wondering if I'd ever amount to anything more than surviving paycheck to paycheck. I started Wilkins Digital Solutions in 1998, with a borrowed laptop, a screaming toddler named Michael, who's now 27, and running his own consulting firm in Portland, and exactly $437 in my checking account. The spare bedroom of our cramped apartment doubled as my office, where I'd work on basic website designs for local small businesses after my son fell asleep. Those early years were brutal. I was 28, recently divorced from Michael's father, who had decided fatherhood wasn't compatible with his dreams of becoming a musician in Los Angeles. While other women my age were going out for drinks and planning vacations, I was teaching myself HTML coding through library books and free online tutorials, fueled by instant coffee and the desperate determination that comes from having someone depending on you. The first real breakthrough came when Holly Chen, who owned a struggling Chinese restaurant in downtown Tacoma, hired me to build her website. She had $500 and a dream of expanding beyond takeout orders. I spent 3 weeks creating something that looked professional enough to attract catering clients from the wealthier neighborhoods. Within 6 months, Holly's business had doubled, and she was recommending me to every small business owner she knew. Word spread slowly but steadily. Local entrepreneurs, most of them women running family businesses, began seeking me out. They appreciated that I understood the struggle of building something from nothing, the nights spent wondering if you were crazy for believing you could succeed where others had failed. By 2005, I'd moved Michael and myself into a modest house in a better school district, hired my first employee, and was generating enough revenue to stop holding my breath every time I paid the bills. My client roster had expanded beyond Tacoma to include businesses throughout the Puget Sound region. I specialized in digital marketing for companies that mainstream agencies often overlooked: immigrant-owned restaurants, family-run retail stores, service businesses that had been operating the same way for decades until the internet changed everything. That's when I met Curtis at a photography exhibition in Seattle's Georgetown neighborhood. I was there researching visual trends for a client's rebranding project, and he was displaying a collection of black and white portraits capturing the faces of Pacific Northwest fishermen. His work was stunning, raw, honest, emotionally compelling in ways that made you stop and really see the subject. Curtis was 38 then, 5 years older than me, with graying temples that gave him a distinguished air and hands that always seemed to be gesturing as he spoke passionately about light and composition, and the stories hidden in people's faces. He'd been a freelance photographer for 15 years, specializing in editorial work for regional magazines and the occasional wedding when he needed to pay rent. Our courtship was different from anything I'd experienced. Where my marriage to Michael's father had been impulsive and naive, built on shared youth and physical attraction that couldn't survive real-world pressures, my relationship with Curtis developed slowly and deliberately. He would drive down from Seattle on weekends. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Bringing his camera to document Michael's Little League games or our visits to farmers markets. He seemed genuinely interested in my work, asking thoughtful questions about digital marketing strategies and client relationships. Curtis understood what it meant to be creative and ambitious while struggling financially. He'd spent years hustling for assignments, dealing with demanding clients, wondering if artistic integrity was worth chronic financial insecurity. When I talked about the challenges of growing my business while maintaining quality and personal values, he nodded with the recognition of someone who'd fought similar battles. We were together for 3 years before he proposed, during a camping trip to Olympic National Park that Michael still talks about. Curtis had planned it meticulously, timing the proposal for sunset at Ruby Beach, with Michael positioned nearby to capture the moment on camera. It was romantic without being theatrical, meaningful without being overwhelming. The wedding planning process revealed our fundamental differences in approach to major decisions. Curtis wanted something artistic and unconventional, a ceremony at the sculpture park, reception at a gallery, everything focused on aesthetic beauty and creative expression. I wanted something that reflected our blended family reality. Michael walking me down the aisle, my business associates included alongside his artist friends, a celebration that honored both our professional achievements and personal growth. We compromised on a ceremony at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel in Seattle, elegant but not ostentatious, with Curtis handling the visual elements while I managed the logistics. The guest list included my key clients, several of whom had become genuine friends over the years, alongside Curtis's photographer colleagues and my small but tight-knit family. Michael, who was 16 then and had grown to genuinely respect Curtis, gave a toast that evening that still makes me emotional when I remember it. He talked about watching me build something important from nothing, and how Curtis had been the first person to support my ambitions without trying to diminish them or make them secondary to his own needs. The early years of our marriage felt like a natural extension of our courtship, two independent professionals who genuinely enjoyed each other's company and respected each other's work. Curtis's photography business flourished partly because my growing network included business owners who needed quality commercial photography. My company benefited from his artistic eye and understanding of visual communication. We bought the penthouse in 2014, when Wilkins Digital Solutions had grown to employ 12 people and was generating annual revenue that shocked me every time I reviewed the quarterly reports. Curtis contributed his share from a successful gallery, showing and several high-profile magazine assignments, but we both acknowledged that my business success was the primary driver of our upgraded lifestyle. Looking back now, I think those were the genuinely happy years when we were true partners building complementary careers. When Curtis's artistic sensibilities enhanced my business instincts, when our different approaches to problem-solving created solutions neither of us would have found alone. The foundation was solid, or so I believed. The prenuptial agreement wasn't Curtis's idea, and it certainly wasn't romantic. It was my insurance policy, born from watching too many successful women lose everything they'd built because they confused love with financial naivety. The conversation happened 6 months before our wedding, in Dakota Carver's law office, overlooking Elliott Bay. I'd met Dakota through the Seattle Women's Business Network, where she'd given a presentation about protecting entrepreneurial assets in marriage. Her statistics were sobering. 60% of small businesses founded by women suffered significant financial damage during divorce proceedings, often because personal and business assets had become legally entangled without proper protection. "I don't understand why this is necessary," Curtis said, shifting uncomfortably in the leather chair across from Dakota's desk. His wedding ring finger drummed against his knee, a nervous habit I'd noticed whenever he felt pressured. "Esther, we're not going into this marriage planning for failure." I reached over and stilled his hand with mine. "We're not planning for failure, Curtis. We're planning for protection. There's a difference." Dakota, who had built her family law practice specifically around high-asset individuals and business owners, nodded approvingly. She was in her early 40s then, with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from having seen every possible way relationships can implode. "Mr. Strauss, think of this like buying homeowners insurance. You don't purchase it because you're planning for your house to burn down. You buy it because if something unexpected happens, you want to be protected. Curtis ran his hand through his hair, disturbing the careful way he'd styled it for this meeting. But insurance protects against external threats. This feels like we're protecting against each other. Not against each other, I corrected gently. Against circumstances that could destroy what we've each worked years to build. Curtis, your photography portfolio and client relationships are yours. My business and its future growth potential are mine. If something happens to our marriage, we each keep what we brought to it. Dakota pulled out a thick folder and spread several documents across her desk. Let me walk you through the standard provisions, and then we can discuss any specific concerns or modifications. The basic framework was straightforward. All assets acquired before marriage remained separate property. Business interests would not be commingled or subject to division. Any increase in business value during marriage would remain with the original owner, provided personal funds weren't used for significant business investment. What about the house? Curtis asked, referring to the penthouse we were planning to purchase together. Joint asset, Dakota explained, since you're both contributing to the down payment. If the marriage ends, it gets divided equally or sold and proceeds split. Curtis seemed more comfortable with this, nodding as Dakota explained how household expenses, vacation properties, and shared investments would be handled. But then we reached the sections that would later prove their worth. Now, let's discuss the infidelity clause, Dakota said, her tone remaining professionally neutral despite the uncomfortable subject matter. Curtis shifted again. Is that really necessary? I had insisted on this provision after watching my friend Holly go through a devastating divorce when her husband left her for his business partner. Not only had Holly lost her marriage, but her ex-husband had claimed half the value of the restaurant she'd built, arguing that his unpaid labor as occasional delivery driver and weekend cashier constituted significant contribution. The infidelity clause is straightforward, Dakota continued. If either party engages in extramarital relationships, they forfeit certain financial benefits that would otherwise be available through marriage. She outlined the specifics methodically. Any spouse proven to have had affairs would lose claims to business assets, ongoing revenue streams, and spousal support. They would retain access to jointly held property like our home, but the betrayed spouse would be protected from having their life's work divided with someone who had violated the marriage contract. Curtis was quiet for several long minutes, studying the documents with the same intensity he brought to reviewing contact sheets. Finally, he looked up at me. Esther, do you really think I would ever cheat on you? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications about trust, commitment, and the practical realities of protecting oneself from unlikely but devastating scenarios. Curtis, I think you're a good man with strong moral principles, I said carefully. I also think people change, circumstances change, and temptations arise that we can't predict. This isn't about what I think you'll do. It's about making sure that if either of us makes choices that destroy our marriage, those choices don't also destroy what we've built professionally. Dakota added quietly, Mr. Strauss, I've handled divorce cases where people were absolutely certain their spouses would never betray them. The infidelity clause isn't just about affairs, it's about ensuring that if someone chooses to end the marriage through destructive behavior, they don't get rewarded financially for that choice. Curtis asked several more questions about specific scenarios, working through hypotheticals with the thoroughness that made him an excellent photographer. What if one of us developed feelings for someone else, but didn't act on them? What constituted proof of infidelity? How would business assets be valued if the clause was triggered? Dakota answered each question with patient professionalism, explaining burden of proof requirements, the difference between emotional and physical affairs, and the independent valuation processes that would be used if the prenup needed to be enforced. There's one more provision I want to include, I said, pulling out notes I'd made after researching other business owners' experiences. If company resources are used to facilitate or support an affair, expense accounts, company properties, business credit cards, that should be considered aggravating circumstances that trigger additional penalties. Curtis looked genuinely surprised. Do people actually do that? More often than you'd think, Dakota replied grimly. Business owners sometimes use company resources to fund relationships, thinking it's more discreet than using personal accounts. It's a form of embezzlement that can devastate both the business and the betrayed spouse. We spent another hour fine-tuning language, adding protections for intellectual property, and establishing procedures for business valuation. Curtis asked intelligent questions and suggested reasonable modifications, but I could sense his underlying discomfort with the entire process. Finally, Dakota presented the completed document for our review. 23 pages of carefully crafted legal language that would, if necessary, determine how our lives would be divided if our marriage failed. Curtis signed it with a slight frown, his artist's hands handling the pen with characteristic precision. "I hope we never need this," he said quietly. "So do I agreed, adding my own signature with steady confidence. "But if we do, we'll both be protected." Neither of us could have imagined, sitting in that law office 15 years ago, how prescient those protections would prove to be. The first decade of our marriage felt like everything I'd worked toward, without knowing I was working toward it. Curtis and I settled into a rhythm that enhanced both our careers while creating the kind of partnership I'd watched other couples struggle to achieve. By 2012, Wilkins Digital Solutions had expanded beyond my wildest early projections. We'd moved into a sleek office space in Seattle's South Lake Union District, hired 18 employees, and were managing digital marketing campaigns for clients across the Pacific Northwest. The company that had started in my spare bedroom was now generating over $8 million in annual revenue. Curtis's photography career flourished alongside my business growth. His commercial work included campaigns for several of my clients, creating a synergy that benefited both our professional lives. His artistic projects gained recognition too. A series documenting the changing face of Seattle's waterfront was exhibited at the Henry Art Gallery, and Pacific Northwest magazine featured his work in a cover story about regional artists making national impact. Our penthouse became the kind of home I'd fantasized about during those early years of counting every dollar. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Puget Sound, and Curtis transformed one room into a professional darkroom, where he could develop film when digital projects left him craving the tactile satisfaction of traditional photography. I converted another space into a home office, where I could work on strategic planning without the daily interruptions of managing a growing team. We entertained frequently, hosting dinner parties that brought together my business network and Curtis's artistic community. These gatherings became legendary among our friends, carefully curated guest lists that sparked fascinating conversations between entrepreneurs and creatives, tech innovators and traditional artists. Curtis had a gift for creating an atmosphere where people felt comfortable sharing ideas outside their usual professional circles. The financial security allowed us luxuries that had seemed impossible during my single mother years. We purchased the vacation home in the San Juan Islands, a restored 1920s cottage where Curtis could photograph the dramatic Pacific Northwest coastline, while I worked on long-term business development away from Seattle's daily demands. Michael, now finishing college at University of Washington, brought friends to the island house during summers, and Curtis captured candid moments that became treasured family photographs. Travel became a regular part of our lives. Curtis would research photography destinations while I identified markets where my business model might expand. We spent 2 weeks in Iceland, where Curtis documented the otherworldly landscapes, while I studied how European small businesses approached digital marketing. A month in New Zealand combined his passion for landscape photography with my exploration of international business practices. Curtis surprised me for my 45th birthday by organizing a photography exhibition featuring portraits he'd taken of my clients over the years. The project, titled Builders, showcased the faces behind the small businesses that formed my company's foundation. Holly's weathered hands holding her grandmother's recipe book, the determined expression of Maria Gonzalez, who'd expanded her cleaning service into a 50-employee operation, the proud smile of James Kim, whose family restaurant had grown from a single food truck to 3 locations. The exhibition opening was held at a gallery in Pioneer Square, with nearly 200 guests including clients, colleagues and friends. Seeing my business relationships through Curtis's artistic lens was deeply moving. He'd captured something essential about these entrepreneurs that my marketing campaigns, despite their success, had never quite conveyed. "You built more than a business," Curtis said during his remarks that evening, his arm around my waist as we stood before the portrait wall. "You built a community of dreamers who wouldn't give up. That's worth documenting." Our personal relationship deepened during these years in ways that surprised me. Curtis was genuinely interested in the strategic aspects of growing my business, offering insights about visual branding and client psychology that enhanced my marketing approaches. I found myself drawn into his artistic process, learning to see composition and lighting in ways that improved my understanding of how images could convey brand messages. We talked for hours about our respective work, sharing successes and frustrations with someone who understood the challenges of creative entrepreneurship. When Curtis struggled with artistic block, I'd suggest business trips where he could photograph new environments. When I felt overwhelmed by the complexity of managing rapid growth, he'd encourage strategic retreats to our island house where I could think without distraction. The financial pressures that had dominated my 30s were replaced by the luxury of choice. We could invest in Curtis's equipment upgrades without calculating how it would affect grocery budgets. I could hire additional staff when projects demanded it, rather than working 18-hour days to manage everything personally. We supported causes we cared about: arts education programs, small business development initiatives, environmental conservation in the Pacific Northwest. Looking back, I realize those years represented the culmination of everything I'd hoped marriage could be: two independent people enhancing each other's lives, while maintaining their individual identities and aspirations. We were successful separately, and more successful together, creating something larger than either of us could have achieved alone. Michael graduated from college and started his consulting firm with financial backing from both Curtis and me. Watching him apply lessons he'd learned from observing our work ethics was profoundly satisfying. He'd inherited my strategic thinking and Curtis's attention to detail, combining them into an approach that was uniquely his own. By 2015, life felt perfectly calibrated. The changes started so subtly that I initially dismissed them as normal fluctuations in a long-term marriage. Curtis began working later, staying in his darkroom well past midnight, when he'd previously joined me for our evening routine of reviewing the day's successes and challenges over wine and cheese. "The lighting on this series isn't right," he'd explain when I'd knock gently on the darkroom door. "I need to reprint these shots for the Morrison Gallery submission." It seemed reasonable. Curtis had always been perfectionist about his work, sometimes spending days adjusting contrast and exposure to achieve exactly the mood he envisioned. But the frequency increased, and our conversations about daily life became shorter, more perfunctory. His phone began commanding more attention during meals. Curtis had never been particularly attached to technology. He preferred film cameras to digital, handwritten notes to electronic calendars, but suddenly he was constantly checking messages, his brow furrowed with concentration that used to be reserved for artistic problems. "Just coordinating with the gallery about installation details," he'd say when I'd comment on the interruptions. "You know how complicated these exhibition logistics can be." I did know. I'd watched Curtis navigate gallery relationships for over a decade, and while they required communication, they'd never demanded this level of constant contact. But I was simultaneously managing the most complex expansion in my company's history: negotiations for a Portland office, staff additions, and a major contract with a regional healthcare network that would increase our revenue by 30% if executed properly. My own work demands intensified during this period. The healthcare contract required evening calls with administrators across different time zones, weekend strategy sessions with my senior team, and travel to Portland twice weekly to establish our satellite office. When Curtis and I were both home, we were often in our respective offices, focused on our individual professional challenges. The physical intimacy that had always been a cornerstone of our relationship began shifting in ways that were hard to pinpoint, but impossible to ignore. Curtis seemed distracted during our intimate moments, as if part of his attention was elsewhere. Our spontaneous affection, the casual touches while passing in the kitchen, the brief shoulder massage when one of us was stressed, became less frequent. "Are you feeling all right?" I asked one evening in December, finding Curtis staring out our bedroom window at the city lights below instead of sleeping. Just thinking about the direction of my work, he replied without turning around. Wondering if I'm pushing myself artistically or just repeating successful formulas. This kind of artistic introspection was familiar territory for Curtis, so his explanation seemed reasonable. Creative professionals often experienced periods of questioning and restlessness. I'd gone through similar phases with my business, wondering if growth and success were dulling my innovative edge. But when I tried to engage him in deeper conversation about his artistic concerns, something that had always been a strength of our relationship, Curtis seemed to deflect rather than explore the topic. Previously, we'd spent hours discussing his creative process, analyzing what different projects meant to him personally and professionally. Now he'd change the subject, or claim he needed to work through these questions independently. The travel pattern changes were more concrete, but equally explainable. Curtis began taking photography assignments that required overnight trips, sometimes extending weekend shoots into multi-day excursions. His calendar showed legitimate bookings: a wedding in Spokane, a corporate portrait session in Vancouver, a landscape series in the Columbia River Gorge. The client wants to capture different lighting conditions, he'd explain when I'd express surprise at the extended timelines. Dawn and dusk shots require staying overnight to catch the optimal natural light. This made technical sense. Curtis had always been particular about lighting, and some of his most successful pieces had required patience to capture specific atmospheric conditions. But the frequency seemed unusual: 3 overnight trips in November, 4 in December, 2 extended weekends in January. I found myself paying attention to details that had never seemed significant before. Curtis showered when he returned from assignments, even short local shoots that wouldn't typically warrant immediate bathing. He was more particular about his appearance when leaving for photography work, spending extra time on grooming that seemed excessive for technical shoots. His interaction with my business associates at social gatherings became noticeably different. Where Curtis had previously engaged enthusiastically with my clients and colleagues, asking genuine questions about their businesses and offering thoughtful observations about their marketing challenges, he now seemed to participate out of obligation rather than interest. Curtis seems quiet lately, Holly observed after a holiday party at our penthouse. Is his work going well? He's wrestling with some artistic direction questions, I replied, realizing I was repeating his explanations without really understanding what they meant. The most unsettling change was hardest to articulate: a sense that Curtis was emotionally distant even when physically present. During conversations, I'd catch him looking at me with an expression I couldn't interpret, as if he were seeing me differently or considering something he wasn't ready to share. When I'd ask if everything was all right, he'd smile and deflect with comments about work stress or artistic pressure. But the smile didn't reach his eyes the way it had for the previous decade. I told myself these were temporary adjustments, natural evolution in a mature marriage where both partners were dealing with professional growth and creative challenges. Every long-term relationship experienced periods of distance and reconnection. I had no idea I was watching my husband fall in love with someone else. April Strauss arrived at Wilkins Digital Solutions in March 2018 with credentials that impressed even my most skeptical senior managers: Northwestern University MBA, 5 years at a prestigious Chicago marketing firm, and a portfolio of campaign successes that demonstrated both creative vision and analytical rigor. At 28, she possessed the kind of polished confidence that suggested she'd been groomed for leadership roles since childhood. She's exactly what we need for the healthcare expansion, my operations manager Arthur Carver told me after April's final interview. Someone who can speak both creative and corporate languages fluently. I agreed. April's presentation during the interview process had been flawless. She'd researched our company thoroughly, identified areas where our healthcare marketing could be strengthened, and proposed strategies that were both innovative and practical. Her references from Chicago were glowing, describing her as brilliant, dedicated, and professionally ambitious in all the right ways. April was strikingly beautiful in a way that seemed almost engineered for professional success. Auburn hair always perfectly styled, wardrobe that managed to be both sophisticated and subtly fashionable, makeup that enhanced her natural features without appearing overdone. She commanded attention when she entered a room, but did so through competence rather than deliberate dramatic flair. Her first month exceeded every expectation. April quickly mastered our client management systems, identified inefficiencies in our campaign development process, and began building relationships with healthcare administrators who had been resistant to our previous approaches. She worked late, arrived early, and volunteered for additional projects that showcased her capabilities. April has already improved our response rates with the hospital network by 15%. I told Curtis over dinner 6 weeks after her hire. She's proposing some fascinating approaches to patient engagement that could revolutionize how healthcare organizations think about digital outreach. Curtis seemed unusually interested in these updates, asking detailed questions about April's background and specific contributions to our healthcare campaigns. His curiosity struck me as supportive rather than concerning. He'd always been engaged with my business challenges, and April's success was significant enough to warrant discussion. When I invited April to our annual company retreat at the San Juan Islands house, Curtis volunteered to document the weekend with candid photography. It seemed like natural synergy. I wanted professional quality images of our team-building activities, and Curtis enjoyed opportunities to capture group dynamics in relaxed settings. Watching April interact with Curtis during that weekend, I noticed her asking thoughtful questions about his artistic process and expressing genuine appreciation for his commercial photography work. She seemed to understand the technical aspects of his craft in ways that impressed him, commenting knowledgeably about composition choices and lighting techniques. April has a good eye, Curtis told me as we cleaned up after the weekend. She understands how visual elements can enhance marketing messages in ways that go beyond basic graphic design. This observation seemed professionally relevant rather than personally significant. April's visual sophistication was one of the qualities that made her valuable to our healthcare campaigns, where compelling imagery could make complex medical information more accessible to patients. Back in Seattle, April began stopping by our penthouse occasionally for work-related discussions that extended beyond normal office hours. She was developing a comprehensive strategy for expanding our healthcare services, and the complexity of the project sometimes required evening meetings when detailed planning could proceed without daily operational interruptions. April's strategic thinking is remarkable, I told Curtis after one of these sessions. She's identifying opportunities for growth that I hadn't even considered. Curtis had been present during some of these meetings, contributing insights about visual branding that enhanced April's strategic recommendations. Their professional collaboration seemed to energize both of them, creating marketing concepts that combined his artistic sensibilities with her business acumen. I began noticing April's presence in our social media feeds and company communications more frequently. She had a gift for positioning herself at the center of important projects, earning recognition for successes while managing to avoid visible association with any setbacks. Her networking abilities were impressive. Within 3 months, she'd established relationships with healthcare executives throughout the region. April's apartment was featured in Seattle Metropolitan's Young Professionals section, showcasing a space that perfectly reflected her sophisticated aesthetic sense. The article mentioned her rapid rise at Wilkins Digital Solutions and quoted her thoughts about the future of healthcare marketing in the Pacific Northwest. She's building quite a professional profile, Curtis observed, showing me the magazine spread. That kind of visibility could benefit the company's reputation in the healthcare sector. His attention to April's media coverage seemed appropriate given their collaborative work on visual branding projects. But I noticed he'd purchased the magazine rather than simply mentioning the article, and he'd read it thoroughly enough to quote specific passages about April's career philosophy. During company social events, April demonstrated remarkable social intelligence, engaging colleagues at every level while managing to spend significant time in conversation with Curtis about photography techniques and artistic vision. She asked him to explain the technical aspects of his exhibition pieces, listened attentively to his thoughts about the relationship between commercial and fine art photography. April really understands the creative process, Curtis mentioned after our summer company picnic. It's refreshing to meet someone who appreciates both the artistic and business sides of professional creativity. At the time, this seemed like evidence of April's sophisticated professional development and Curtis's generous mentorship of a promising younger colleague. I had no idea I was watching the beginning of my own destruction. The first concrete evidence that something was seriously wrong came from an unexpected source: my company's expense management system. As CEO, I received monthly reports on all corporate credit card activity, usually reviewing them perfunctorily since my senior managers handled most operational expenses responsibly. But in September 2018, reviewing the August statements, I noticed irregularities that made me pause. April's corporate card showed charges at high-end restaurants on evenings when she claimed to be working late on client proposals. More specifically, these were charges for 2 meals at establishments far too expensive for solo dining. At times when she'd told me she was having working dinners with healthcare administrators who consistently paid for their own meals during our business meetings. Arthur, I asked my operations manager during our weekly review, are you aware of any client dinners that April has been hosting independently? Arthur checked his notes carefully. Not that I'm aware of. The healthcare network executives prefer lunch meetings at their facilities, and they've been very consistent about handling their own meal expenses when we do meet off-site. I made a mental note to follow up, but didn't immediately jump to suspicious conclusions. April was ambitious and could have been cultivating new business relationships that hadn't yet appeared in our official client pipeline. Proactive networking was exactly the kind of initiative I encouraged among senior staff. The photography equipment rental charges were harder to explain. Curtis had been using company resources occasionally for projects that would benefit our marketing efforts, but the amounts and timing seemed unusual. Professional camera and lighting rentals for weekend sessions, high-end equipment that exceeded what our typical commercial photography required. When I casually mentioned these expenses to Curtis, he explained that he was documenting April's healthcare marketing presentations with more sophisticated equipment to create promotional materials that could showcase our capabilities to potential clients. April suggested that higher production value in our portfolio pieces would help us compete with larger agencies, he said, his explanation sounding reasonable but rehearsed. The rental costs are minimal compared to the potential return if we land bigger healthcare contracts. This made business sense, but something about Curtis's tone bothered me. He was providing information rather than engaging in the collaborative discussion that typically characterized our conversations about business expenses. My friend Holly, who had become increasingly perceptive about relationship dynamics since her own divorce, noticed changes during our monthly lunch meetings. Curtis seems different lately, she observed in October, watching me check my phone repeatedly during our meal. More distant, and you seem more anxious than I've seen you in years. I set down my phone, realizing she was right. He's been working on some intensive photography projects, and I'm managing our biggest expansion ever. We're both under more professional pressure than usual. Holly studied me with the directness that had made her successful in business and valuable as a friend. Esther, I've known you for 20 years. Professional pressure makes you more focused, not more nervous. This is something else. Her observation forced me to acknowledge what I'd been avoiding, that my hypervigilance about expense reports and Curtis's explanations wasn't just managerial diligence, but growing intuitive concern about patterns I couldn't quite identify. That evening, I decided to review our home security system logs, something I'd never done before in 15 years of marriage. Our penthouse building maintained digital records of key card access for insurance purposes, tracking when residents and their guests entered and exited. The data revealed that Curtis had been bringing a guest to our apartment during times when I was traveling for business. The access record showed 2 key cards being used for entry on 3 occasions in September, always on evenings when Curtis had told me he was working alone on portfolio development. I cross-referenced these dates with my travel calendar and April's work schedule. Each instance coincided with my business trips to Portland, and April had taken personal time on those same dates, claiming she needed long weekends to recharge from the intensity of our healthcare campaign development. The coincidence felt too precise to be accidental, but I needed more concrete evidence before drawing conclusions that could destroy both my marriage and my company's most promising employee relationship. I began paying closer attention to Curtis and April's interactions during office visits and company events. Their professional collaboration had evolved into something that seemed more intimate, though still potentially explicable as enthusiasm for shared creative projects. They spoke in shorthand references that suggested extensive private conversations about work topics. April would smile in response to Curtis's comments in ways that seemed to acknowledge jokes or observations I hadn't heard. During our company Halloween party, I watched Curtis photograph April more frequently than other employees, directing her poses with the kind of careful attention he typically reserved for paid portrait sessions. Their collaboration appeared effortless and natural, as if they'd worked together extensively in settings I hadn't witnessed. April photographs beautifully, Curtis told me later, reviewing the images on his camera's digital display. She has natural instincts for positioning and expression that make the photographer's job easy. His professional assessment was accurate, but something about his tone when discussing April's attributes felt different from how he typically evaluated other subjects' photogenic qualities. I realized I was conducting an investigation into my own life, gathering evidence about my husband's potential betrayal while simultaneously hoping that evidence would prove my suspicions wrong. The truth was becoming harder to deny, but I still needed absolute certainty before taking action that would irrevocably change everything. The definitive proof came in November through our shared cloud storage account, the same system Curtis and I had used for years to back up family photos and important documents. Curtis had always been less tech-savvy than me, relying on automatic syncing without understanding exactly what information was being stored or how to selectively exclude sensitive content. While organizing our digital files for tax preparation, I discovered a folder labeled Portfolio Development that contained images I'd never seen before. The photographs were technically excellent, displaying Curtis's signature style and attention to detail, but the subject matter made my blood run cold. April in our vacation home at the San Juan Islands, photographed during what appeared to be an intimate weekend getaway. The images weren't explicitly sexual, but they captured a level of comfort and familiarity that spoke to extended private time together. April curled up in the reading chair by our stone fireplace, wearing one of Curtis's oversized sweaters. April preparing breakfast in our kitchen, caught in candid moments that suggested the photographer was someone with whom she felt completely relaxed. The timestamps revealed these photos had been taken in early October, during a weekend when Curtis had told me he was attending a photography workshop in Vancouver. I'd been in Portland finalizing lease agreements for our satellite office, trusting that Curtis was pursuing professional development that would benefit his artistic growth. More damaging than the intimate nature of the photographs was their location. Curtis had brought April to our most personal retreat, the place where we'd made some of our most important life decisions, where I'd found peace during the stressful years of building my business. The violation felt more profound than simple adultery. It was a desecration of spaces that held deep emotional significance for our marriage. I copied the entire folder to a secure drive before Curtis could discover my access to these files. Then I called Dakota Carver, my attorney, requesting an emergency consultation. "Esther," Dakota said, when I arrived at her office the next morning, "you look like someone who hasn't slept in weeks." I hadn't slept the previous night, spending hours analyzing every photograph, every detail that confirmed my worst suspicions. "I think Curtis is having an affair with one of my employees. I have evidence, but I need to understand my legal options before I decide how to proceed." Dakota reviewed the photographs and documentation I'd gathered with the clinical detachment that made her an excellent attorney. She asked methodical questions about April's employment status, her access to company resources, and the timeline of her relationship with Curtis. "The prenuptial agreement is very clear about infidelity consequences," Dakota confirmed, "but we need to establish a documented pattern that goes beyond these photographs. We also need to consider how this situation affects your business interests, since April is your employee and potentially using company resources to facilitate this relationship." She recommended hiring a private investigator to gather additional evidence and document any misuse of corporate assets. The suggestion felt surreal, hiring strangers to spy on my husband and employee, but Dakota explained that emotional evidence wouldn't be sufficient for legal proceedings. "Curtis will likely deny the affair or minimize its significance," she warned. "April might claim the photographs were taken for professional purposes, or that their relationship is platonic friendship that you're misinterpreting. We need irrefutable documentation." I spent the afternoon interviewing investigators, feeling like I was auditioning people to document the destruction of my marriage. I selected Everett Wilkins, a former FBI agent who specialized in corporate fraud cases and understood the intersection between personal betrayal and business impropriety. "Mrs. Wilkins," Everett said during our consultation, "in cases like this there are usually financial irregularities beyond what you've already discovered. If your husband and employee are involved romantically, they may be using company resources more extensively than you realize." He was right. Over the following week, Everett's investigation revealed a pattern of corporate credit card abuse that I'd missed in my monthly reviews. Curtis and April had been using company funds for romantic dinners, hotel rooms during supposed business trips, and equipment rentals that served no legitimate business purpose. Most damaging was evidence that April had been sharing confidential client information with Curtis, who was apparently using insider knowledge about our healthcare campaigns to develop competing proposals for his own freelance photography business. This wasn't just adultery, it was corporate espionage that threatened my company's competitive position. I also discovered that April had been gradually positioning herself to take over key client relationships, subtly undermining other employees while presenting herself as indispensable to our healthcare expansion. Her networking activities weren't just ambitious professional development, they were calculated attempts to gain leverage within my own company. The investigation revealed hotel bookings for Curtis and April at expensive resorts during weekends, when they'd claimed to be working on separate projects. Credit card records showed purchases of jewelry and gifts that neither had reported as business expenses, but had clearly been bought using corporate accounts. They've been conducting their affair using your business as their personal entertainment fund, Everett summarized in his final report. This creates grounds for both criminal prosecution and civil recovery, beyond just the prenuptial agreement violations. Armed with this evidence, I faced a choice that would determine not just my personal future, but the fate of the company I'd spent 20 years building. I could confront Curtis and April privately, hoping to minimize business disruption while enforcing the prenuptial agreement. Or I could pursue full legal consequences, including criminal charges for embezzlement and corporate fraud. Dakota advised caution. Your primary goal should be protecting your business interests and ensuring these two can't cause further damage. Revenge feels satisfying, but strategy produces better long-term results. I scheduled a meeting with Curtis and April for the following week, ostensibly to discuss April's healthcare campaign progress. Neither suspected that I'd discovered their betrayal, or that I was prepared to enforce consequences they'd apparently never considered possible. The prenuptial agreement that Curtis had signed reluctantly 15 years earlier was about to prove its worth in ways neither of us had anticipated. The boardroom at Carver Associates felt like a courtroom as I arranged the evidence across the mahogany table. Dakota had suggested neutral territory for this confrontation, away from my office where emotions might overwhelm strategic thinking. Curtis and April arrived separately, both clearly confused about why our routine healthcare campaign review required legal offices and formal documentation. "Thank you both for coming," I began, my voice steady despite the earthquake occurring beneath my composure. "We need to discuss some irregularities that have come to light regarding company resources and professional boundaries." April straightened in her chair, her confident smile faltering slightly. "Irregularities? I'm not sure what you mean, Esther. My campaign results have exceeded every projection we established." Curtis remained silent, but I noticed his photographer's hands trembling slightly as he reached for the water glass. Dakota's assistant had provided. He'd always been able to read my moods better than April could, and something in my tone was clearly triggering alarm bells. "Your campaign results have indeed been impressive," I agreed, opening the first folder. "But your expense reports tell a different story. Would you like to explain these restaurant charges for two people during evenings when you claim to be working alone on client proposals?" I slid the credit card statements across the table, watching April's face process the implications. Her confident mask remained intact, but I caught the quick glance she shot toward Curtis, a moment of silent communication that confirmed their coordination. "I've been developing relationships with potential healthcare administrators," April replied smoothly. "Networking dinners are essential for expanding our client base beyond the current contract." "Interesting," I continued, opening the second folder. "Because I've contacted each administrator on your reported meeting list, and none of them recall having dinner with you during these dates. In fact, several mentioned they haven't seen you outside official board meetings in months." The color began draining from April's face, but she maintained her professional composure. Curtis shifted uncomfortably, his eyes fixed on the documents I was systematically revealing. "Perhaps there was some confusion in my record-keeping," April suggested, her voice taking on a slightly defensive edge. "With so many networking activities, it's possible I misremembered specific details." "Memory issues would explain the restaurant discrepancies," I acknowledged, opening the third folder. But they don't explain these hotel bookings. The Fairmont Olympic, weekend reservations for 2 guests, charged to company accounts during periods when you both claimed to be working on separate projects. Curtis finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Esther, we can explain everything. This isn't what it looks like. Really? I asked, pulling out the photographs from our cloud storage. Because these images from our San Juan Islands house suggest it's exactly what it looks like. The photographs landed on the table like grenades. April's professional mask finally cracked completely, revealing the calculation beneath her polished exterior. Curtis's face went ashen as he stared at evidence of their intimacy, in the space I'd considered our most private sanctuary. How did you? Curtis began, then stopped, realizing the question revealed his guilt more completely than any denial could. Automatic cloud backup, I replied calmly. The same system we've used for 15 years to store family photos. Your technical ignorance about digital privacy just documented your betrayal in high-resolution detail. April recovered first, her MBA training kicking in as she assessed the situation strategically. Esther, I understand you're upset, but workplace relationships happen. Curtis and I developed feelings for each other while collaborating professionally. We never intended for this to affect the business. The audacity was breathtaking. She was attempting to frame systematic corporate theft and adultery as an office romance that had simply gotten complicated. You're absolutely right, I said, reaching for the prenuptial agreement. Workplace relationships do happen. Fortunately, I planned for exactly this scenario 15 years ago. I opened the document to the infidelity clause, the pages marked with sticky notes highlighting the relevant provisions. Curtis, I believe you remember Section 12, subsection C. Any spouse engaging in extramarital affairs forfeits all claims to business assets, intellectual property, and ongoing revenue streams. Curtis stared at the prenup as if seeing it for the first time, though I knew Dakota had explained every clause in detail during our original consultation. Esther, please, we need to discuss this privately. 15 years of marriage has to count for something. It does count for something, I replied, my voice gaining strength with each word. It counts for exactly what we agreed it would count for when you signed this document, which you did willingly, with independent legal counsel, after every provision was explained in detail. April leaned forward, desperation creeping into her voice. This is vindictive, Esther. Using a legal technicality to punish people for falling in love. Falling in love, I repeated, opening the final folder containing Everett's investigation results. Is that what you call embezzling corporate funds to finance hotel rooms and romantic dinners? Is that what you call sharing confidential client information to help Curtis develop competing photography proposals? The evidence of corporate espionage and financial fraud sprawled across the table: bank records, email communications, documented misuse of company resources that went far beyond simple adultery. You weren't just betraying my marriage, I continued, standing to look down at both of them. You were systematically stealing from my company while planning to use insider information to become my business competitors. Curtis's voice broke slightly. We never meant for it to go this far. No, I agreed, gathering the documents that would soon be filed with both family court and the district attorney's office. You meant to get away with it. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Seattle traffic far below the conference room windows, the ordinary world continuing while theirs collapsed around them. The silence stretched until April finally spoke, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. What happens now? I remained standing, looking down at the two people who had systematically dismantled my personal and professional trust. Now you both learn that actions have consequences that extend far beyond whatever romantic fantasy you've been living. Curtis attempted one last appeal to our shared history. Esther, I know I've made terrible mistakes, but surely we can work something out. 20 years together, building a life, supporting each other's careers, that has to mean something. It meant everything, I replied, feeling an unexpected wave of grief beneath my controlled anger. Which is exactly why your betrayal is so devastating. You didn't just have an affair, Curtis. You used our home, our shared resources, our business relationships to facilitate a relationship that was designed to replace me entirely. Dakota cleared her throat professionally. Mrs. Wilkins, should we proceed with the documentation we discussed? I nodded, and she began distributing legal papers that would formalize the destruction Curtis and April had created informally. Mr. Strauss, these are divorce papers, citing infidelity with documented evidence. Miss Strauss, this is your immediate termination from Wilkins Digital Solutions, along with notification that criminal charges are being filed for embezzlement and corporate fraud. April's composure finally shattered completely. Criminal charges? This is insane. We used a few company credit cards for dinners. Every business has gray areas around expense accounts. $27,000 in fraudulent charges over 8 months, I corrected, consulting Everett's final accounting. Hotel rooms, jewelry, equipment rentals, restaurant bills, all charged to company accounts for personal use. That's not a gray area, April. That's systematic theft. Curtis was staring at the divorce papers as if they were written in a foreign language. Esther, please can't we discuss this privately? Without lawyers and criminal charges? The time for private discussion ended when you brought your mistress to our vacation home, I replied, surprised by how steady my voice remained. When you decided to photograph your affair in locations that held sacred meaning for our marriage. I sat back down, feeling suddenly exhausted by the emotional toll of maintaining professional composure while my personal world exploded. Curtis, did you really think I wouldn't discover this? Did you believe I'd built a $15 million business by being naive about financial irregularities and behavioral patterns? He looked genuinely confused, as if my competence as a businesswoman had somehow never translated in his mind to competence at protecting myself personally. I hoped we could find a way to transition without destroying everything. Transition to what? I asked. To you leaving me for April while maintaining access to the lifestyle my business success provided. To April gradually taking over my company while using insider information to compete against me. April finally found her voice again, though it carried a bitter edge that revealed something closer to her true character. You're destroying people's lives out of spite, Esther. Curtis and I found something real together. Just because your marriage was already failing doesn't mean you have the right to ruin our future. The accusation that my marriage had been failing, that their affair was somehow a mercy killing of an already dead relationship, sparked the first genuine anger I'd allowed myself to feel during this confrontation. My marriage wasn't failing, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. My marriage was being systematically undermined by two people who decided their desires were more important than honesty, loyalty, or basic professional ethics. I stood again, gathering my personal belongings while Dakota organized the legal documentation. April, your career in healthcare marketing is finished. No reputable firm will hire someone terminated for embezzlement and corporate espionage. Curtis, your comfortable existence as the artistic husband of a successful entrepreneur is over. You'll be dealing with alimony obligations based on your actual earning capacity, not the lifestyle you've grown accustomed to. Curtis made one final attempt at emotional manipulation. This vindictive approach isn't like you, Esther. You're being influenced by lawyers who profit from conflict. The woman I married would find a more compassionate solution. I paused at the conference room door, looking back at the man who had shared my bed, my dreams and my business success for 15 years. The woman you married was trusting enough to build a life with someone she believed shared her values. The woman standing here now has learned that trust without protection is just another word for vulnerability. Dakota handed Curtis and April each a business card. All future communication goes through my office. Any attempt to contact Mrs. Wilkins directly will be considered harassment and documented accordingly. As we left them sitting in the conference room surrounded by evidence of their betrayal, I heard April hiss something to Curtis about expensive lawyers and vindictive women. Their true characters were finally emerging now that the consequences were inescapable. Walking through downtown Seattle toward my car, I felt a strange mixture of relief and devastation. The confrontation I'd been dreading for weeks was finished, but the real work of rebuilding my life was just beginning. The prenup that had felt like cold business insurance 15 years ago had just proved to be the foundation upon which I could reconstruct everything they'd tried to destroy. The legal machinery moved with surprising efficiency once Dakota filed the paperwork. Within 72 hours, Curtis had been served with divorce papers, April had been escorted from our offices by security, and the King County Prosecutor's Office had opened an investigation into the embezzlement charges. The speed of these proceedings reflected the strength of our evidence, but also Dakota's strategic decision to file everything simultaneously, preventing Curtis and April from coordinating their responses or attempting to conceal additional evidence. The prenup is holding perfectly, Dakota informed me during our follow-up meeting. Curtis's attorney attempted to challenge the infidelity clause on grounds of emotional distress, but Judge Harrison dismissed that argument immediately. The photographic evidence and financial records make denial impossible. Curtis had hired Thomas Brennan, a divorce attorney with a reputation for aggressive tactics in high-asset cases. But even Brennan seemed overwhelmed by the documentation of systematic betrayal and corporate fraud that Dakota presented. They're requesting a settlement conference, Dakota continued, but from a position of complete weakness. Curtis has no viable defense against the infidelity clause, and April's criminal charges create additional pressure for quick resolution. The settlement conference took place 1 week later in a neutral conference room overlooking Elliott Bay. Curtis appeared significantly thinner than when I'd last seen him, his artistic confidence replaced by the hollow expression of someone grappling with consequences he'd never anticipated. April wasn't present. Her criminal attorney had advised against participating in civil proceedings that might compromise her defense against embezzlement charges. But her absence spoke volumes about how completely her career ambitions had collapsed. My client acknowledges that mistakes were made, Brennan began carefully, but feels that Mrs. Wilkins's response is disproportionate to the circumstances. A brief romantic relationship shouldn't result in complete financial destruction, Dakota responded with clinical precision. Mr. Strauss engaged in systematic adultery while using corporate resources to finance that adultery, then conspired with an employee to embezzle company funds and share confidential business information. This wasn't a brief romantic relationship, it was a calculated betrayal with criminal implications. She spread the financial analysis across the conference table. The prenuptial agreement specifically addresses these circumstances and was signed voluntarily with full legal counsel. Mr. Strauss is entitled to retain his personal assets acquired before marriage and his individual retirement accounts. Everything else reverts to Mrs. Wilkins as the non-offending spouse. The numbers were stark. Curtis would keep his photography equipment, his personal vehicle, and about $60,000 in retirement savings. But he would lose access to our penthouse, the vacation home, joint investment accounts worth over $2 million, and any claim to my business assets. More devastating was his loss of spousal support. The prenup's infidelity clause eliminated any obligation for me to provide financial assistance during his transition to independent living. He can't survive on photography income alone, Brennan protested. Mr. Strauss has grown accustomed to a certain lifestyle based on Mrs. Wilkins's business success. Eliminating spousal support condemns him to financial hardship. Mr. Strauss should have considered that possibility before violating his marriage vows. Dakota replied without sympathy. The prenuptial agreement clearly outlined these consequences. Ignorance isn't a valid defense when the contract was explained in detail before signing. Curtis finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Esther, I know I don't deserve mercy, but is there any possibility of some transitional support? Just enough to establish an independent photography business. I looked across the table at the man who had shared my life for 15 years, who had celebrated my business successes and comforted me during difficult periods. The temptation to soften the prenup's harsh consequences was real, not from lingering love, but from muscle memory of caring about his well-being. But then I remembered the photographs of April in our vacation home, the systematic theft of company resources, the calculated nature of their betrayal that had extended far beyond simple adultery. Curtis, I said quietly, when you signed the prenuptial agreement, you agreed that infidelity would result in these exact consequences. You can't now claim those consequences are unfair simply because you chose to trigger them. The settlement conference concluded with Curtis accepting the prenup's terms in full. He would vacate our penthouse within 30 days, surrender all claims to joint assets, and acknowledge that his infidelity voided any spousal support obligations. April's criminal case proceeded separately. The prosecutor's office, impressed by the documentation Everett had gathered, offered a plea agreement requiring full restitution, 3 years probation, and a felony conviction that would effectively end her marketing career. She's accepting the plea, Dakota informed me a week later. $27,000 in restitution plus court costs. The felony conviction means she'll never work in financial services or corporate marketing again. The swiftness of these resolutions felt almost anticlimactic after months of suspicion and investigation. Both Curtis and April had discovered that their romantic fantasy had real-world consequences that extended far beyond the temporary pleasure of forbidden attraction. The prenup performed exactly as designed, Dakota observed as we reviewed the final settlement documents. It protected your business interests, while ensuring that betrayal came with appropriate financial consequences. I signed the divorce decree on a gray February morning, officially ending 15 years of marriage with the stroke of a pen. The document felt both momentous and routine, a legal formality that recognized what had already ended emotionally months earlier. Curtis and April's attempt to destroy my marriage while enriching themselves had instead triggered protections that left me stronger and them devastated. Justice, it turned out, was a prenuptial agreement enforced with precision. 2 years later, I stood in the same boardroom where I'd confronted Curtis and April, but this time I was celebrating rather than demolishing. Wilkins Digital Solutions had just been named Pacific Northwest Digital Marketing Agency of the Year, and my team of 32 employees was toasting our expansion into California and Oregon markets. To second chances, my operations manager Arthur raised his glass, and to leaders who know how to protect what they've built, the irony wasn't lost on me. Curtis and April's betrayal, which had felt like the end of everything I'd worked toward, had actually freed me to pursue opportunities I'd been too comfortable to consider. Without the emotional energy drained by a failing marriage and a disloyal employee, I'd focused entirely on business growth with remarkable results. Michael, now 31 and running his own successful consulting firm, had driven up from Portland for the celebration. "Mom," he said quietly as we stood by the windows overlooking Elliott Bay, "I need to tell you something I couldn't say 2 years ago. Watching you handle Curtis's betrayal taught me more about strength and self-respect than any business lesson ever could." The company's success had attracted acquisition offers from major marketing conglomerates, but I'd declined them all. The business I'd built from nothing would remain independent, a legacy I could control entirely without risk of future betrayal or manipulation. My personal life had evolved more slowly but just as deliberately. I'd purchased a contemporary house in the Queen Anne neighborhood, designed specifically for my tastes without compromise or accommodation for anyone else's preferences. The space reflected my aesthetic completely: clean lines, professional home office, art collection featuring Pacific Northwest artists whose work resonated with my sensibilities. Dating remained a distant consideration. The violation of trust that Curtis and April had created would take time to heal, and I wasn't interested in rushing toward vulnerability before establishing complete emotional independence. "Any regrets?" Dakota asked during our quarterly legal review, a tradition we'd maintained since the divorce proceedings. I considered the question seriously. None about the prenup or how I handled their betrayal, some about trusting so completely that I ignored obvious warning signs. But even those regrets feel educational rather than painful now. The prenuptial agreement that had once seemed like unromantic insurance had proved to be the most important business decision of my life. It had protected not just my financial assets, but my ability to rebuild with dignity and strength. Curtis had relocated to Portland, where he was reportedly struggling to establish an independent photography business without the social connections and financial cushion that had supported his previous work. April had left Seattle entirely, her marketing career permanently damaged by the felony conviction. Their attempt to steal my life had ultimately returned it to me in purified form: business success without emotional compromise, financial security without dependence, professional relationships built on mutual respect rather than romantic delusion. As I locked my office that evening, I reflected on the woman who had insisted on a prenuptial agreement 20 years earlier. She had somehow known that protection wasn't cynical but essential, that love without boundaries was just another word for exploitation. That younger version of myself had saved the older version from destruction, creating space for the person I was still becoming: independent, successful, and finally free. The prenup had protected more than my business. It had protected my future. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.